Barakata Yahweh, Barakata Yahabushai, Bahasham, Barakahakwadash, Barakatum. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, glory, and infinite honors to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahabushai. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone who ruled and teach well. And peace and salutations to you sincere Akim out there, pushing this word in truth and sincerity to the four corners of the globe. May you brothers endure to the end. This is the Brother Ra'aya with another video, and I'm going to start it off in Mark chapter 3, verses 24 to 25. And if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. Point blank, period. If you look at every kingdom or a rulership that has fallen in the past, usually how did they fall? It started with them breaking down internally. They got decadent. The people got divided. It just became a fractured society. And then what? The upcoming power on the outside just put the final nail in the coffin and took them down and became the next power. Look at the nation of Israel, for example. You had the split between the northern and the southern kingdom, and then the whole kingdom fell apart, and that's where we're at today, with only the elect of the nation of Israel coming back to their power, Yahweh Bahasham Yahabushai. And this is going to be no different for the current kingdom or rulership right now by the biblical Edomites, known as these so-called white people today. And we can see in their countries all across the planet, from Europe and especially in the United States of America, they're divided on a whole host of issues internally. Their societies are becoming fractured. They're becoming decadent and morally corrupt and economically weak, and they're eventually going to fall. And that's what I'll be dealing with in this video, showing just another example of this kingdom of the Edomites being divided. This is an article from RT.com titled, Hungary Calls for European NATO. The EU, or European Union, is doing Washington's bidding since Americans have the last word, the Hungarian Prime Minister believes. And again, this is just another example of the kingdom being divided, and it will eventually fall. And you've got a lot of friction in this last leg of the fourth beast that we're currently living in, the reincarnated empire, the NATO-EU alliance that the U.S. is a part of, the main power structure ruling the planet right now. You've got the U.S. constantly bullying and giving dictates under her European allies, and you've got these different European Edomite nations getting sick of it and calling for change, as we're seeing with what the Hungarian Prime Minister is about to say in this article, that the EU needs to stop being so subservient to the U.S. because it's always these European nations in the EU and NATO that feel the blowback from U.S. adventurism, usually military adventurism abroad, that they get dragged into. Just look at, for example, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the Libyan civil war, or the Syrian civil war. You had the U.S. and other EU nations that had bullied into getting involved in those conflicts, overthrowing or trying to overthrow those sovereign leaders. In the case with Libya getting completely overthrown and them trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. And then what did you see? A refugee crisis, with the majority of those refugees not going to the U.S., but going into Europe, leading to a whole host of other problems. And now you've got this situation with Ukraine. You've got the U.S. pushing for war against Russia through this whole Ukrainian situation. And what? It's dragged in these European nations. And if and when nuclear war breaks out, what? These European nations are going to be on the front lines of that nuclear exchange. And a lot of them know this. So they're constantly calling for, look, we need a change to things. If we keep allowing the U.S. to bully us into these different situations, what? We're going to be the ones to feel the brunt of it. Again, a kingdom divided cannot and will not stand. And what this is ultimately going to culminate into is all of America's allies, chiefly her European Edomite allies turning against her at some point during World War III and completely allying themselves with nations like Russia and China. And they're all together going to shoot 200 million nuclear missiles onto the U.S., turning it into the biblical lake of fire from sea to shining sea, and then a desolate, uninhabitable wasteland afterwards. But let's get into this article. Europe needs its own military bloc, free of American influence, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban told Swiss magazine Weltwoche on Thursday. The politician accused the U.S. of dragging Europe into a conflict that cannot be won and risking a global war. And Hungary is a member of the EU as well as NATO. The solution would be a European NATO, Orban said, arguing that America's desire for further expansion of its influence is what led to the current tensions between the West and Russia. Moscow is concerned about NATO expanding further east into Ukraine and Georgia, Orban stated, referring to his conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin just weeks before the conflict between Moscow and Kiev erupted in late February 2022. Putin told me his problem was with the American missile bases in Poland and Romania and possible NATO expansion in Ukraine and Georgia, Orban told the Swiss media, noting that the Russian leader was concerned about the U.S. potentially deploying its weapons to these nations as well. And that's the ultimate goal of the U.S., to completely surround and isolate Russia and to take them down. According to the Hungarian premier, that was one of the underlying reasons behind the conflict in Ukraine. I understand what Putin said. I do not accept what he did, Orban explained. He insisted that Hungary should stay out of the conflict, but added that Budapest was subjected to constant pressure as other Western nations want to drag us into the war through every possible means. Further divisions within this kingdom. You've got the U.S. bullying European nations into following after their dictates to go against Russia and other nations they deem as enemies, and then the nations of Europe that are more in camp and aligned with U.S. interests are bullying other European nations to do so and follow after the U.S.'s dictates. Divisions at all levels. Orban believes that this is because the EU is serving the interests of the U.S. at the expense of its own. Decisions made by Brussels reflect American interests more often than European ones, he said. And that's a part of biblical prophecy in the scriptures. Let's go to Daniel chapter 7, verses 19 to 20. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, those legs of iron in Daniel chapter 2, which was the ancient pagan Roman Empire under the Edomites, which was diverse from all others. And what made the Roman Empire diverse from the kingdoms before it was the fact that it had a Senate house and didn't have a king. It had a consul and a proconsul, which served as your ancient presidents and vice presidents and stuff like that. What you see in America today with the Senate House and different politicians voting on different laws and measures. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from all others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron and his nails of brass, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet, and of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other that came up. And now we're fast forwarding into the last leg of the fourth beast, the reincarnated Roman Empire. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, speaking of that little horn, which is the United States of America, and before whom 3 fell, those 3 that fell before, referring to Britain, France, and Spain, who were the main players in the so-called New World, or the North American continent, before the 13 colonies took over and became what you see as the United States of America today, which is at the head of this NATO EU alliance, that last leg of the fourth beast. Hence why they're the ones that are always making all the major decisions, and these other European nations follow suit behind them, and why you've got people like Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, complaining about it and saying that Europe needs to get underneath from the feet of the US and start making its own decisions and walking its own path. Even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. And when you go into that word stout, it means great in the sense of power, which the U.S. is more powerful than a lot of these other European NATO nations. Really, the U.S. spends a lot of money for these other NATO European nations to keep up NATO, and the U.S. is more stout and proud of them as well, and feels like it can do whatever it wants and get its allies to follow after whatever it wants them to follow. If it doesn't want its European nations to do business with nations like Russia or China, they'll put situations into place to completely destroy viable economic, political, and military ties. Just look at what happened with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project between Germany and Russia. Hey, the U.S. didn't want Germany getting closer to Russia, so what did they do? They sabotaged it, and now that deal is under the water, literally. But again, let's read what Orban just said. He insisted that Slovakia. Orban believes that this is because the EU is serving the interests of the US at the expense of its own. Hey, that little horn whose look was more stout than his fellows, so he feels entitled, proud to do whatever he wants and throw around his weight to get his European allies to follow after him, even at their own expense. Decisions made by Brussels reflect American interests more often than European ones, he said. Orban argued that Western nations need to demonstrate the true desire and will for peace in Ukraine, adding that this is what is lacking today, at least in the West. And that's it with this article. But again, just another example of this last leg of the fourth beast, this final kingdom of the heathen rulership by the biblical Edomites being divided. And as it said back in Mark chapter 3, verse 24 to 25, if a kingdom and a house be divided, it shall fall. But let's get that Daniel 2, since we've been quoting it all throughout the video. And Daniel chapter 2, verses 36 to 43 is dealing with that dream that King Nebuchadnezzar of the ancient Neo-Babylonian Empire had of that statue of a man made of different metals, which was symbolic for the different heathen kingdoms that would rule before the ushering in of the kingdom of heaven under the children of Israel. The children of Israel being known today as the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans. And the head of gold was speaking of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the arms and the breasts of silver, the Medo-Persian Empire, the belly and the thighs of brass being the Greco-Edomite Empire, the legs of iron being the Edomite Roman pagan empire, and then those iron toes mixed with miry clay being the reincarnated Roman Empire, the last leg of the fourth beast, the NATO EU alliance that the US is a part of. This is Daniel chapter 2, verse 40. And I like how they put these little headers before each kingdom to let you know what it's talking about, which a couple of years ago, they didn't have this. And this just goes to show the power of the prophets of Yahweh Bahashem Yahweh Shai, chiefly through GMS or Great Millstone, as well as the brothers coming in the spirit of Great Millstone, breaking down these scriptures in 144% truth and clarity, which is teaching these other people out here that think they know the scriptures but don't, to see what it's actually saying. So they're updating things accordingly to try to keep in touch with what the prophets are saying. But Daniel chapter 2 verse 40, and it says, Rome and the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. And iron is a very strong metal, and the Roman Empire was known for using iron-made weapons. They even had a legion called something along the lines of the Iron Legion. Verse 41. Now we're coming into the last leg of the fourth beast, which started coming back into power at the Renaissance, which Renaissance means rebirth. The rebirth of the Edomites coming back into a position of power. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. And that part of iron and part of clay goes into the stronger nations of this current beast system and the weaker nations. Your stronger nations being the US, Britain, France, Germany, and the weaker nations, usually known as the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, which are nations that have weaker militaries and economies within this NATO EU system. And I looked up Hungary, and Hungary is, kind of a middle of the road nation. They would lean more towards the clay, so they would be one of the lesser strong nations in this current system. And as we can see from what Viktor Orban said, hey, they are divided on how they feel about this current situation between the West and Russia over Ukraine, and just in general. They feel that, Viktor Orban feels that the U.S., that Hungary needs to get out from underneath the feet of the U.S. as well as these other European nations, and they need to make their own path, because if they keep going down that destructive road that the U.S. is making a path down, hey, they're going to get blowback from it. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. And if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. But there shall be in it of the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, and as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And this whole NATO EU system is heavily fractured, hence why so-called Western civilization is on the decline, which you can clearly see. You can see people within these different Western nations complaining about how things weren't like it was back during World War II and before. We're becoming weak morally, economically, and militarily. And if we don't do anything, our entire way of life is going to come to an end, which is exactly what's going to happen. And like I said at the beginning of the video, what's ultimately going to culminate from all this friction is all of America's allies, especially her European allies, turning against her and allying themselves with nations like Russia and China, and they're all together going to shoot those nuclear missiles onto the U.S. This is the book of Obadiah, and I'm going to start at verse 1 and jump around a bit. And this whole book is dedicated to the downfall of you Edomites. And the header reads, Edom will be humbled. The vision of Obadiah. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh concerning Edom. We have heard a rumor from Yahweh, and an ambassador is sent among the heathen. And that ambassador sent among the heathen is the men of the Lord, the prophets of the Most High, chiefly through GMS or Great Millstone. And again, the brothers that come in the spirit of GMS, out on the highways and byways preaching this word, as well as putting video epistles like this, going to the gates of the nobles, telling you Edomites and telling you your elites that your kingdom is going down, as well as these other heathens, and you're all going into slavery under the children of Israel in the kingdom of heaven. Arise ye, and let us rise up against her in battle. Now I'm going to jump down to verse 7. All the men of thy confederacy, or your allies, have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee. You've got these European nations that are siding with the U.S. are trying to keep calm with the U.S. in regards to Ukraine and other situations, eventually deceiving them and completely turning against the U.S. and prevailed against thee. They that eat thy bread, getting all that financial assistance for NATO and other institutions in Europe have laid a wound under thee, taking all that money and all that military hardware and turning it against the U.S. by allying themselves with Russia and other nations that are adversaries of the U.S. There is none understanding in him. And what this is going to culminate into is those 200 million nuclear missiles hitting the U.S. and turning it into the biblical lake of fire from sea to shining sea, and then a desolate, uninhabitable wasteland afterwards. This is Revelation chapter 17, verse 16. And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast. The 10 horns, speaking of the EU or European Union, beginning with the first 10 common markets of the EU, back when it was known as the European Economic Community. And Hungary is a part of the EU, which thou sawest upon the beast. NATO, which Hungary is also a part of. These shall hate the whore that rides upon the beast. Mystery Babylon, Babylon the Great, that mother of harlots, the United States of America, that little horn whose look was more stout than her fellows, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire, that nuclear fire, point blank period. So that's it with this video. And with this video, I hope you sincere Akim and Akwath were edified. Just keep strong. As we can clearly see, we are almost out of this final wicked captivity of the heathen nations, chiefly of the Edomites, primarily from the United States of America. And as always, I'm going to say Abad Babal, Kwam Yasharala, and until next time, Shalom.